So now we're going to move into the scarcity of water, climate change, and Indigenous stewardship of forest ecosystems, and I'll invite up Shannon McPhail.
Climate change is a pretty big topic. Scarcity of water is something that we've witnessed here, living in the Skeena, Nass, other watersheds. 2018 drought was a pretty big indicator of what's to come. And last year was also a pretty big indicator of what's to come. So I'd like to call up three really incredible panelists. Dr. Kira Hoffman, who specializes in the use of fire to help mitigate impacts of climate change and to restore integrity to ecosystems using cultural practices that have been utilized by Indigenous people since time immemorial, and for a very long time were outlawed and are making a resurgence. So please welcome Dr. Kira Hoffman to the panel. I'd also like to introduce Mike Risdale, who had a major role in trying to hold government and industry accountable to their own laws in the case of Coastal GasLink. He's participated in a number of studies, academic papers, which he's going to talk about today, and he's been an invaluable resource and superhero in trying to go through tens of thousands of pages of permits and applications and assessments to see what is industry saying versus what is actually happening on the land. What do the province and the federal regulators and inspectors do? How does that relate to reality? What does the law say and what actually happens? And you'll find there's quite a bit of a discrepancy. So I'd like to welcome Mike Risdale, please. And joining us on Zoom, because he is one of the most incredibly busy humans I know, running the Tea Creek farm, and it's more than a farm, it is a lifestyle, it is a massive, he's changing the world, and he's doing it by empowering youth, giving people skills, training, and returning to natural sort of indigenized systems of food security, sovereignty, and just holding space for people to do the things that build community. So I'd like to introduce Jacob Beaton on the big screen with Zoom. And we're going to start with Mr. Beaton. So Mr. Beaton, can you please introduce yourself, give us a little bit of info about the incredible project of Tea Creek, and tell us what you're seeing when it comes to impacts of climate change.
So I'll start with a sound check. Can you hear me all right there? Testing, 1, 2, 3.
5 by 5.
All right, thank you. So yeah, Jacob here from Tea Creek. My traditional name is Gye'awin Skiik. I'm Skiik Eagle clan. Ts'msyen, Haida, Heiltsuk ancestry on my First Nation side, and English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, whole UK basically on my non-Indigenous side. So I've got a handful of slides. I know we're behind schedule, so I'll blast through them as quickly as possible and keep it as short as possible. So our vision at Tea Creek is healthy, resilient Indigenous communities and economies based on abundant local food. The way I like to summarize this is that our past is our future. Basically, all First Nations were food sovereign plus, producing an abundance of food through stewardship of the land, not only pre-colonization and pre-settlement, but post-colonization and post-settlement for hundreds of years before Indian Act laws started to destroy the Indigenous food-based economy. So I just got three things I want to touch on. First one is the value of Indigenous lead. When we're talking about climate change, some of the things we're seeing here, is no rain for extended periods, drought, wildfires, and relatively extreme heat. So 37 degrees a few days ago here in Kitwanga in a rainforest zone. So just for context, if you're under 10 inches of rain a year, then you are technically a desert region, and we are under 4 inches of rain so far all year at Tea Creek. The other thing we're seeing, obviously, with climate change, everyone's experiencing it, we experience it pretty acutely on a farm, is unpredictability of weather. So we're seeing, we had 2 frosts in June, which is unheard of in the old days, really, and we're seeing record heat and huge swings, like 20, sometimes 30 degrees Celsius swings in temperature from one day to the next. And we're seeing the consequences, right? We're seeing expensive consequences to everybody on this planet. This is the Sumash former lake turning back into a lake in the lower mainland in the not too distant past. Let's see here if my slides keep working. There we go. This is the kind of the crux of what I want to talk about with Indigenous lead, is that 80%, over 80% actually, of the world's remaining biodiversity is in Indigenous controlled lands, which makes up 20%, according to the United Nations, of the world's land. And Indigenous people, I learned this at the COPE conference in Montreal, Indigenous people globally are carrying currently 32% of the world's duties and burdens and outcomes in fighting global warming and climate change, on less than 1% of the world's financial resources. So this data is, hopefully everybody knows it, but it's becoming more and more mainstream, like this information. What I want to talk about is Indigenous led, because the key thing behind this data is that Indigenous people are making their own decisions on their own land, and that's what makes it work. That's what makes the fight against climate change actually work. So if we take non-Indigenous worldviews, ideas, business models, they're not as effective as Indigenous worldviews. So Indigenous led is really, really critical. I also wanted to just quickly address something that I learned really recently, which is the use of language. Like we found at Tea Creek, as we engage on sort of cutting edge sort of Indigenous technologies and practices around climate change, that that we're expected as Indigenous people to be way below mainstream, in terms of knowledge, technology. We're expected to be primitives. And this is a relatively modern thing. So I learned, for example, that Indigenous leaders were called kings, queens, ladies, lords, emperors, empresses, right up until around the very late 1700s. And it wasn't until the early 1800s that the word chief started to be used in Canada, and it was enfranchised an Indian Act in the late 1800s. So, you can imagine kind of a world where you're referring to First Nations leaders as you might be able to see in some of the photos, as kings and queens. It's going to give you a very different level of respect for First Nations leaders than calling them chiefs. So the switch to chief was a deliberate piece within the Indian Act to lower the status of First Nations leaders. So I just wanted to bring that up because we find that across the board. It's not just when we're talking about leadership. It comes into play at Tea Creek when we're talking about Indigenous food production and food production technologies. It's often diminished until it's recognized by Western science, and then it's elevated, and then it's often used by non-Indigenous initiatives, companies, people to make money, right? So I just wanted to bring that up and put it forward. The other thing I like to talk about is, when it comes to Indigenous led in Canada, we're not doing a very good job. So according to Corporations Canada, the report in 2023, Indigenous people are currently less than 1% of board of directors, less than 0.5% senior management, and that only 3% of corporate entities and government-related funded entities have set targets for having Indigenous people in leadership positions. And of note that every other minority in Canada, so if you're female, if you're a disabled person, you're a visible minority, BIPOC, the representation has been going up for those other minorities in quotation marks, but not for Indigenous people. Indigenous people, we've been flatlined. in positions of leadership in this country, even 2023. So that leads me to this one. I saw this on Facebook yesterday, and I was like, I got to put that in the presentation. Maintaining the status quo, I see that left, right, and center. It's very hard to be an Indigenous-led organization, meaning that a majority of decisions at every level, every day, are made by Indigenous people. So at Tea Creek, our staff and leadership, our board of directors is 100% Indigenous. Every level is majority Indigenous. So we meet that definition of Indigenous-led. Okay, so just a couple more things. It's a lot harder to get money if you're Indigenous, much harder. And this, being interviewed for a documentary, and the researchers called me, and there's been some really interesting research over the years showing that First Nations targeted funds and Indigenous targeted funds, that sometimes only 10% of it actually gets to Indigenous people. The rest is being absorbed by non-Indigenous people, whether it's specialists, companies, partners, etc. So when you see like all those big First Nations dollars, a minority of it is actually getting down to that Indigenous-led level. Okay, so this is supposed to say number 2, access to land. And I'm almost done here. I'm trying to blast through this quickly. Access to land is a really tough thing for First Nations, and it's listed when we surveyed First Nations on food sovereignty and food production. It was top 3 barrier. And I've got a lot of stories maybe that can come up in the Q&A about the systemic racism that still exists within all kinds of institutions that can make it literally impossible as an individual or a group, First Nations group, self-determining group, to acquire land. So we've been dealing with that a lot. The next one is access to money. So we already know that Indigenous-led First Nations people are leading the fight against climate change globally, but it's really hard to do when you don't have money. And you see that less than 1% of the world's financial resources. This is what it looks like at Tea Creek when we're talking about that. So our primary business is training, because training having trained people to, Indigenous people to do the work is another top 3 barrier that First Nations are facing. So we're trying to fill that gap, but it's really hard to do. This is our funding levels each year, and they're based on what are called seats. So how many people are we going to train per year? They're often negotiated a year ahead of time. And then here's our actual enrollment. So here's the actual number of students who sign up and want to come to Tea Creek. So you can see this year, our funding level is very low. It's actually lower than our first year. And so therefore, we've been kind of trying to slow down the signups and the registration, because we just can't afford to keep up with the First Nations demand. What this doesn't tell you is that we get less than 30% per Indigenous person than similar mainstream organizations get. So this is just the enrollments count. This isn't showing you the dollar difference, okay? So funding is challenging. We've been given all kinds of what I call hoops to jump through. So one was, you need to be institutionalized, you need to be a designated training facility. So we're now Canada's, it turns out, Canada's first First Nations Indigenous horticulture center. So I looked it up. There's only 15 designated training sites across all trades in the province of BC. There's only 21 active non-public designated sites, so like unions, etc., private companies. So Tea Creek is one of the 21 non-public designated sites, and we're the first Indigenous one in horticulture in BC and Canada. And we were told, if you do this, you can get funding. We aced it. We got the highest marks ever on a horticulture site inspection, and no funding. Here's another one: is we were told, okay, the reason we're not funded by government, when we don't have any government funding this year, is because we need to be supported by First Nations. And we were told it's not enough to be supported by our local hereditary chiefs and our regional chiefs and our regional band councils. That all the nations in BC had to support us, which I thought was insane. I was like, this is insane, like to get any money. So BCAFN actually passed a unanimous resolution of support, and then the national executive, which are the BCAFN chiefs of each province across the country passed unanimous resolution calling on governments to fund us. So funding is ridiculously difficult. It's a huge, huge challenge for us. Then the last thing I just want to touch on is training people. So yeah, let's surge ahead. Let's fight climate change. Let's feed people. Let's build local economies based on local food, like we like our ancestors and like we still have today. But we need more people. There's not enough. So what has happened at Tea Creek is we've kind of hit our ceiling in terms of the capacity at our site. So we have about the last 2 years, we've had over 1,200 different Indigenous people come to Tea Creek for at least one day of service. And that's like a lot. And that's our maximum. Like we can't go above that right now with our current facilities. We graduated 140 people from Indigenous people from various training last year. We paid out 30,000 hours in work experience, thanks to some supporters who may be in the audience there today. We served over 100 free meals a day last year during our operating season, which was over 11,000. We drove over 40,000 kilometers to give people rides so they could participate. We provided free mental health support, so that meant therapists and counselors coming on site and providing mental health services. We grew over 20,000 pounds of food and donated it into our First Nations communities. People came from far and wide, including as far away as Prince Rupert, actually, to come and get vegetables. We had 80% of our registered trainees have at least one significant, what we call deal-breaking barrier. So training doesn't really work unless we have additional supports in order to help people overcome those barriers and get them active and trained. So lastly, I did a big paper on this over 2 years, including surveying tons of First Nations across what is now called BC. There's the link. I can provide it later over text if anybody wants it. It's quite in depth. Just in summary, to wrap things up, these are our top 3 challenges at Tea Creek: lack of funding, theft of Indigenous intellectual property. We went through this a lot last year. So I wanted to raise this. Like, it's really hard to, again, go back to that Indigenous-led fighting climate change when you're constantly getting plundered, like you're not getting supported. And then the stuff that you are doing well, non-Indigenous groups and peoples are coming in and taking it and using it for profit or to enrich themselves. Very frustrating. And then the lack of support for Indigenous-led. So like, we're not funded because we're Indigenous, we're funded because we have to shapeshift into these hundreds of different funder colonial model expectations. So these are some of the things that we've been advocating for years, is having our own association, Indigenous-led association, to support grassroots Indigenous-led projects, having an Indigenous-led standard and having that become, because again, if Indigenous people are leading the fight, then it needs to be us leading the fight. We can't have non-Indigenous-led under an Indigenous banner or branding or ownership model getting those resources. So we've been really pushing to say, hey, we need to reshape this towards the Indigenous-led standard, because that's what works. And we see that working at Tea Creek. There's other things here like culturally appropriate training, Indigenous certified suppliers. I can answer any questions about this, but what we saw when we surveyed First Nations is that First Nations were getting charged sometimes double, quadruple, quintuple the price that non-First Nations would get charged for the same product or service. And so it's really hard to get ahead and fight climate change when you're paying, 2 to 5 times for the same services that a non-Indigenous organization would pay. So some of the tools, and I think this will be talked about right now, healthy forests, we're huge advocates, and we see this at Tea Creek. Our water that we use to produce food is coming from a healthy forest, or what remains of a healthy forest. It's carbon capture, it's food provision, it cools the air. Like, you're 10, 15 degrees cooler in a healthy forest than a non-healthy forest when we go through these heat waves. Indigenous plants, so we were advocates for interplanting, reviving and caring for forest gardens, and doing intentional plantings of Indigenous plants when you're reforesting, which is not currently happening. Controlled burns, I'll let somebody else talk about that. And then adapting Indigenous technologies to climate. So we're doing a lot of composting, but there's other Indigenous technologies from outside of our sort of coastal, cooler climate zone that we're supposed to be in. But there's Indigenous nations down in desert regions and climates that are more similar to what we're going into, that we are talking with and looking at sharing Indigenous technologies and adapting it to where we're going with climate change the way it's going right now. So this is it. Thanks for listening. Indigenous-led, you're Indigenous-led, you're fighting climate change. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Jacob. If we could queue up Dr. Kira Hoffman's PowerPoint presentation, that'd be great. And while that's being queued up, Mr. Risdale, would you like to give us a brief overview on your views on the scarcity of water, climate change, and how Indigenous systems and ecosystem management or territorial stewardship planning can play a role? Mike needs his mic.
There we go. Yeah, now you can hear me. It kind of runs off of what I was saying earlier in terms of, you know, if you're talking about Indigenous-led and First Nations decision-making, you need to go through the history of how we get to that point of where are we going and what are we going to be doing in terms of decision-making. For us, we went through the Delgamuukw court case that led to where we're telling the government how we make a decision on the land and how we make the decision through our clans and houses. That went so far as 1987, but then there was another court case in 2011. In 2011, we had another court case, Canadian Forest Products versus SAM. And this hereditary leader was Kayla. And she was trying to protect her last vestige of her house territory where she could still do her food, social, and ceremonial on the landscape that isn't logged out yet. And she was trying to protect that. Her and her family slept in tents, trying to stop the logging roads to go in where they were planning on logging until it went to court. In that court case, they describe the process of decision-making that the Wet'suwet'en do. And in that description, from paragraph 14 to 17, they laid out the way it comes from the people, the hereditary leaders, the clans, and then finally it goes to a feast system to get a final decision. And we were holding our collective breath saying, you know, if the company or BC says anything about this and vetoes it, then our whole process of what we did through Delgamuukw kind of null and voids it. But they didn't say anything. And now, so we got Delgamuukw, which is Supreme Court of Canada, and now we have the Supreme Court of BC for the decision-making of a nation. It goes well beyond the Wet'suwet'en decision-making process. It introduces other First Nations on how they do their decision-making on the landscape. So when you look at water, air, and the land, all of that is part of a process of each house, each territory, each nation that has the ability to make these decisions. And that is now part of BC's law and part of Canada's law. And we have that backed by the court system that says you have to follow our decision-making. And so when we do this, we make sure that we have a process that's laid out from start to finish on how we become to a point of making a decision. The decision isn't based on the First Nation alone. It's the people that are living on the land as well. So you're thinking about other nations, you're thinking about those with homesteads on the landscape and the house groups. How a project wants to come onto the landscape, you have to look at it from the perspective, for that project, is it going to give you enough food, social, and ceremonial space for you to have your food and bring it to a feast system? And when we do that, we then look at the point of view, can our future generations be able to look and make decisions on the same landscape? And we're going to get to that point where we're going to say yes. And when we start looking at climate change, we start looking at working to input the historical content of our cultural practices. That is changing with climate change. Are we harvesting on the same landscape that our ancestors did? Are the timing windows of the animals and the plants that we harvest, are they coming out at the same time that the ancestors did, or are they coming out differently? When we start looking at forest fires and climate change, 2016 was a bad year. Then all of a sudden 2017 came along, which was even a higher rate of forest deprivation in our own territory. So we thought that was really bad until 2023 came along, and it's even getting worse. It's a lot more forest fires and a lot harder, affecting a lot more communities. And it's not just what we look at in terms of our homes and our lands and the animals. You have to look at it from the point of view of water scarcity. Because when a forest fire goes through, everything starts growing all at once, at the same time. Everything needs a lot more water for growth than a full-grown forest. A forest at 80 years doesn't need much water, but a new forest growing takes away any water that's landing on the land. It'll suck it back up by the plants that are there, and not all of it's going into the streams or the rivers where there's salmon are. And so in areas of watersheds that have been devastated by forests or logging, it'll take 50 to 80 years before that watershed can give enough water so that salmon can come back. And then will that salmon come back? These are the new changes in decision making that we have to look at. Because when you start looking at how we made decisions in the past and how we're making decisions into the future, we have to look at the point of climate change. When we were looking at Gerald Amos, there was David Suzuki was at that Kitimat conference that we did on anti-Enbridge piece there, and he says, humans, we are now a force of nature. We are at a point where we're changing the landscape so much that we are changing climate. And what are we going to do in terms of getting the right decisions out? When climate change is happening, we need to adapt to a point where we can actually catch up to it, make good decisions on the landscape for the water, the animals, the people that are on the land, and then get to a point where we can actually say, our future generations are going to have a better outlook on the landscape than what we are currently. But we got to do that change today. And I'm looking at it from a point of view, well, I'm here today with you, but about 20 years down the road, where will I be? Will the next generation that comes up takes the reins on decision making and gets to a point, are we going to have the people trained to help carry that forward and do good decisions with the court cases that we want? And are those decisions going to affect everybody, similar as well as the animals, so that we can still do our food, social, and ceremonial and have our cultural practices for generations more to come? I think one of the last things I want to touch on is back in November, I co-wrote a paper with Chelsea Armstrong, Ann Spice, and John Welch. They're my co-writers on this paper. And it was about liberating trails and travel routes in Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en territories from the tyrannies of heritage resource management regimes. I mean, it's a long-winded title, but really it touches on changes to the landscape and how we make those decisions. And then what is government doing in terms of allowing us to make those decisions, getting to a point where are we working together to get to the right decision, or are we forging ahead trying to get to a point where we as a nation are doing good decision making but is the government trying to work with us to get to that point of, are we going to be having BC and the First Nations in the same room to collectively make right decisions on the landscape? In this paper here that we did, we were talking about the tyrannies of management on regime on heritage resources. So when the pipeline came into our territory, I tried to protect this one trail. It was called the Queese War Trail. And I brought Parks Canada out there. Parks Canada walked it with us, and they said, yes, this is a real trail. And I says, great, give me a letter that states that it is a real trail, and put your letterhead on it. And they did that. I gave it then to BC. I gave it to the company that was planning on the right-of-way, and they shelved both of them without really digging into it, saying, okay, we see that it's a real trail. Next, the company hired an anthropological group or a company that was new to it to assess whether or not that was a trail. Well, they just came from Kitimat over the mountains where there was lots of cedar, and in their report they said, I don't see any cedar here. They don't have cultural information because there's a lack of cedar. And they didn't get to a point where they assessed our trail that our ancestors died on and are still on that trailway. So it was really significant because they're buried there. And when the company said it's not a real trail, that allowed them to put the right-of-way there and build on it. And so that paper that company wrote saying that it wasn't a real trail is now part of what we call gray paper. It's out there. Anybody can look at it and say, okay, I don't see a trail, I don't see history in this area, I'll believe this paper. And they won't talk to the actual First Nation. Well, we had to combat that by putting a paper out saying, here's the tyrannies of those kind of decisions. Go to the nation where these historical information are, the heritage of that nation is what's being affected. Talk to them, get it right the first time, and then allow us to work together to move forward. And so this paper, I think I've got about 20 copies if anybody needs a copy. And the neat thing is, about a month ago, I got an email from a university down in Florida, and the university said that they look at all of these papers that were put out by American anthropologists over the past 3 years, and our paper won an award. So I get to go to Florida in November to accept an award for this great paper that we put out, trying to protect the territories and trying to protect our natural history and our culture. And I'll be taking that forward to them, saying, you know, this is only a step one. We need to get where we're working together instead of having to say that there is heritage tyrannies out there. That shouldn't be said. It should say, let's work together. Let's work as a unity to and concisely make good decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So in a rainforest that has desert level rainfall and trails that don't exist unless some person who is not from here comes and doesn't look and says whether or not it does, kind of reminds me of in the days of the sacred headwaters when Shell was given permission to drill right alongside the Skeena because there were no documented salmon in that area. And I'll never forget Jenny Kwok, one of the most beloved Klabona keepers who has since passed on. And she said, well, just because you guys don't know they're there doesn't mean they're not. And she showed them the gaff hooks and showed them all the evidence that these fish were present in the sacred headwaters. And it was John Knoll and Loveman Knoll and many who sat there and camped for weeks and waited for the salmon to come. And when they finally arrived, they called Gitxsan watershed authorities, who came up in a helicopter and pulled samples off and documented those salmon. And the simple act of documenting them and putting them on paper was what we needed for Shell to pull out of that specific spot in the sacred headwaters. And that was non-Indigenous and Indigenous people coming together, Western science and traditional inherent science coming together for the fish. But it's just a bit gobsmacking that something that people have known for thousands and thousands of years needs to be corroborated by somebody who is not from there in order to make it real, when it's been very real for many generations for the people who live here. So, to Dr. Kira Hoffman, how do we solve all this climate change, scarcity of water stuff with returning to burning? No pressure.
No pressure. Okay. Yeah, it is very worrying that we constantly have to have Indigenous knowledge verified by Western science. I can kind of continue through my presentation here if we want to dim the lights, but
Oh yeah, let's keep the lights off.
this is how you get a sunburn in Prince Rupert. just the light here. So thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be a guest on this territory, and I'm coming from Wet'suwet'en territory. I live in Smithers, and I do place-based research. I am a fire practitioner. I love fire. I believe fire should be free. I think fire is right, and my whole role is to support returning to burning. And Indigenous-led solutions to wildfire. So wildfire is this really complex thing, and it was touched on by everyone. It's really impacting all of our lives through smoke, health-related impacts, evacuations, damage to our land and water. It's also just this really incredibly healthy thing for our forests. And it's so healthy because people have been using fire in British Columbia for millennia as a tool for resource management. They've used it to care for the land, and many places where settlers come and think, wow, this is just so wonderful here. It's because people have been burning it for thousands of years. They've been using fire, of course, to have food and medicines, because fire really equals food. And so most people now are just seeing fire as this really frightening thing on the news, and they're not seeing that other side of it. I've been burning with my son for about the last year. He just turned 7, and I can just see it in his eyes. Like, I'm creating a future pyrophile. It's scary, it's wonderful, but it's really a part of kind of knowing fire. I've worked in government. I was a firefighter for many years, and I didn't like it. All we did was put out fires, and I felt like that's wrong. And, you know, people who use fire, they know that's wrong, because we should be putting fire back on the land, not just putting it out. I am so privileged to work in Gitxsan territory. I've been asked to come out and support their fire stewardship program and kind of share my experience of fire. I'm also someone who's been deeply impacted by wildfire. I lived in California for many years, lost our home to wildfire. It's carry a lot of trauma and stress about that. But so I kind of understand. I understand that there's disproportionate impacts. And when I look at communities, I can't help but see some of the risk, but then I also can't help but see the opportunity. And I also work with Ts'msyen Nation. I'm starting to work with the Wet'suwet'en Nation to kind of revive burning. So really putting Indigenous-led fire stewardship forward, and also understanding that it's a practice that's very specific to communities. It's very different. It's intergenerational. It's all about bringing people together. And there's so many amazing stories about, you know, lightning as a teacher, lightning as doing the work. And also a lot of stories about fire being connected to salmon. And so when I hear, you know, Karuk people in Northern California talk about burning to bring the salmon home, burning to have smoke blanket the rivers so that it's cool enough so that they can make it home during that migration in August. So fire and water are very connected in a good way and not just in a bad way. So this is the fire stewardship team in Gye'awin. We were burning on Gye'awin territory in the spring, so just up from actually the Tea Creek farm, and we burned 40 hectares this spring on 9 different fire days, and it was really powerful. And I'm sharing this with permission from Gitxsan, but Elder Darlene Vey from Wilpwilich, she was moved to tears. We had someone from BC Wildfire come out, and their only job was to just support her physically while she held the drip torch and lit this fire. She lit the first fire, she lit the last fire, and she talks about it so well, about, you know, she's been waiting for 40 years to burn this land. And yeah, it was very powerful. She wants to burn for Ensign Mai. She wants to burn for the one true berry, and that's black huckleberry, and it's all about reviving the health of that berry, making big, tasty, juicy, nutritious berries for people again, having connection to the land, having people come out and pick berries. So when we are burning, we're making sure we're burning as close to community as possible. And my goal is to not, you know, my goal is to just help support and then to just move on. You know, I really want to have guardians out there leading the way, and we're really getting there by building capacity to make that happen. We're also trying to relearn some techniques that have suffered loss. And so, you know, burning for huckleberries is actually very technical. Fire is an art and it's a science, and so much goes into knowing fire, and I'm so humbled all the time by what has been known about fire in the past and what will be known about fire again in the future. Knowing the temperature, knowing the conditions, knowing when the rains are about to come, because huckleberry it's a complex and fickle friend, and it really needs the utmost care. We've been working in partnership with government. It's had its challenges for sure. We just created the first Indigenous-led fire prescription in British Columbia. It had all the Git'awin names, Gitxsan names included in the prescription. We often use the word alak for fire, and you know, the comments back from the government was, well, it looks like lake. You can't really use that. People are going to be confused. And I said, well, I think that the confusion, on the other hand, has been the other way for a really, really long time, so get on board here, guys. We burn for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of reasons at once. It's all about kind of making the land healthy, cleaning the land, caring for people, caring for food systems, and it just goes on and on and on. Fire is not just a thing in the summer, it is a year-round cycle, just like a food calendar. Fire and food and medicine are all really connected. There's times to burn, and fortunately, actually, we're getting more times to burn, more opportunities to burn. We just need people to be more comfortable with burning. And so that is a lot of the work we're doing in schools right now, reaching out so the kids can teach their parents. It's okay to play with matches sometimes. It's okay, you know, to be out there experimenting a little bit with fire. And we all just need to kind of get to know fire in a new way and also get to know fire in the old ways. So thank you.
Okay, let's get
I couldn't see my nose, sorry. I just kind of...
Jacob back up so we can see him. And then we're going to take 2 questions from the audience. And while people are duking it out in a peace and unity kind of way for who's going to get to ask those questions, I'm going to ask a question of each panelist. And all 3 of you have kind of presented a little bit. Kira, fire is an art and science. It's technical, especially for berries. I had no idea. That's really amazing. Some of the world's biggest huckleberry patches are from some of the world's biggest forest fires. And we don't have the berry patches without the fires. And I think it's really incredible, and we need a round of applause for the first Indigenous-led fire prescription in Canada. So the question I would like each of you to answer is, if you could change one thing right now to deal with climate change, scarcity of water, and how we move forward, what would that one thing be and why? And we'll start with you, Jacob.
Oh no, you didn't give me these questions ahead of time to think about. Well, I think I covered it in my presentation. Being Indigenous-led as a standard and driving funding towards Indigenous-led will make the biggest change nearly instantly if we could wave the magic wand. And we'd start to see the Indigenous-led projects and initiatives fighting climate change, holding water, preserving forests, which hold almost all of our water actually in this part of the world. So that's what I would do.
Thanks. Kira?
I'm probably going to get fired for this. I really do believe that fire is a right and that people should have access to it, knowing the limits of it, knowing the risks of it. It can be really challenging when so much of fire is out of our control. And so bringing that control back, so encouraging people to get to know fire, whether that's sitting around a campfire, because it all makes us feel really good. Also, I guess reaching out and using fire a little bit more if that's like of comfort. There's a lot of laws and regulations and liabilities in place that are stopping a lot of this good work. And so pushing back on that, I think, is what I would say.
Thank you. Mike?
I think, just like this conference here today, it's unity. We need one voice. If we're all going in different directions and not being cohesive, and government's taking advantage of that, then we're not united, and we're not going to have that ability to get good decision making in terms of what we're going to do. You got to remember, as First Nations, we are the caretakers. We are the environmentalists. We are the scientists. We are the decision makers. Let's get together and, as one voice, give a decision on what we need to do next for the next generation. Masai.
There are some people upstream who are doing some really cool work. Where's Drew Harris? Is she here? She is here. Can you come up here, please, Drew? Come on. She wasn't prepared for this. I didn't ask her permission ahead of time. I want to hold Drew up because she worked in the community of Skiik along the Skeena River, and she followed behind BC Wildfire Service, who were clearing a fire break around the community of Skiik that also experienced a fire last year that threatened their community. And she's working with a team of bioremediation folks. Lila Darwish is heading it up, and Anissa Watson, and then a grad student from UBC named Kirsten. And they followed behind the BC Wildfire Service, three women with chainsaws and a chipper, and they cut all the trees up into nice chunks that the BC Wildfire Service had felled, and they put them all through the chipper, and then they inoculated those giant chip piles full of wild mushroom mycelium. And the goal is to test that in how we look at waste from forestry, or how we store and sequester carbon instead of burning it. So slash piles create somewhere between 6 and 12% of emissions. And Drew and her crew of badass women, instead of burning those slash piles, filled them with local mushrooms, like little mycelium, and that mycelium goes in there and it breaks down that wood. Just last week, they stuck their hands in that pile. It's only been a few weeks. That pile is moist, it's damp. But it could have been a big wildfire concern had they not shipped it and inoculated it with mycelium. They're also using mycelium to eat slash piles, and what else? Anything. So there's mushrooms now growing out of that pile in the community of Skiik, and there are all these really great solutions that people have known about for a really long time. And I'm grateful to the universities and others who team up with Indigenous leaders on the land to make the solutions that are custom-based for that place. Are there any other questions from the audience before I let Drew sit down? Do you have anything you want to say, Drew? Do you want to introduce yourself? Okay.
I'm Drew Harris, and I'm a new intern at SWCC with Shannon and Grace over there. And yeah, it's been really cool learning about all the tools we can use to help fight climate change.
Do you have any questions for the panelists?
No.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to call Drew up because I actually think the greatest cure for all of the things we're talking about and the greatest hope that we have is in the youth. And Jacob Beaton is doing that in spades. 1,200 people going to his farm. Mike Risdale gets people out on the land and works with people in community, works with researchers, helps build all these solutions. Kira, you saw the photos of all the people from Gitxsan who are taking back these cultural practices. So if there are any more questions about climate change, scarcity of water, and reinvigorating Indigenous territorial stewardship plans, speak now, and then speak lots later. Okay, so I'm going to give each panelist like 2 minutes to wrap up and talk about whatever they would like to, because these people really are incredible knowledge holders, and I would recommend that all of you tackle them if you can and give them the support that they need. Jacob put out a pretty significant call. We see the work that he does. It's clear that he does need more support to make more of that happen. So we'll start with Kira this time, and we'll work, then we'll go Mike and then Jacob, and we'll wrap this up. So each take like 2 minutes to talk about the future you see for climate change adaptation and mitigation.
I actually have to leave after, so I'm not going to be here for mingling, but I do encourage you to get in touch if you're interested in talking about fire. Maybe I will do something a little different. If people are comfortable, can you put up your hand if you've been evacuated by a wildfire? Anyone here? Just a few. Prince Rupert, pretty safe spot. Rainiest town. It is. It's pretty incredible. I think that I would just like to say thank you, and please reach out if you have questions about fire and getting in touch or trying to have a fire stewardship program. If you're interested in that, there's ways to do it. And yeah, I'm so excited by Tea Creek. I haven't had the chance to stop by, and I feel like there's a lot of biochar conversations to be had, which is another great future.
And Mike.
I kind of led to it where, we're leading up to a decision, but we also need the youth to step up. We need them to stay in school, get that learning, because you are our future leaders. You are the ones that will take that next step in our decision-making processes, and you will lead your nation. And so stay in school, get to the point of empowering yourself to get to where we need you to help us. We can only take it so far. The next generation has to do the next step. The thing that I was looking at is working to incorporate historical cultural practices into modern understanding. Modern understanding of our cultural practices are still outdated, and they're still trying to understand it. And if the youth are being able to step up and do that, then we're going to be able to look at it in terms of change and harvest in the future. It's going to be you and your children and the children after you that you're working towards. You're going to take the seat where I'm sitting, and you're going to be able to give a presentation and say, we heard when we were younger about what we have to do and where we have to go in terms of leadership. And then, can we evolve? Can we, as a cultural people, evolve to a point where our decision-making will work in the future that affects what climate change is doing to us? Are we going to be able to have the laws of our culture tied to harvest? Does this evolve? Would you be able to do that? And that's, I put that forward to you. Can you do that? Take that next step. Ms. I, thank you.
Okay. And Jacob.
Hi, everybody. So Shannon mentioned youth. I just want to acknowledge that Shannon and I were youth not that long ago. Hey, Shannon? Well, maybe a long time ago. I thought I'd start with that because as a young Indigenous person, when I started my first business, I had just all kinds of hope for the future. Like I thought that there'd be a lot more space for Indigenous youth in this country to take, to take space in the economy and in the decision-making economy, and make a fair living. What we're seeing, so I'll start with some bad news, that what we're seeing is that not much has changed. In fact, a lot of things are worse. So at Tea Creek, again, like we do a lot of data. I heard that mentioned. The barriers are significant and real. I just want to acknowledge I've been privileged in my life, and I've had an easier path than most of the youth that we see today, who are really hungry to be active, who are really hungry for culture and connection and the land. That's why we have 1,200 people show up a year, is just because people want to, right? So so the good news is there's a huge amount of interest and drive amongst First Nations people everywhere to get back to our land and to produce food, be food sovereign. We have to keep in mind that 60%, I believe it's more than that now, of Indigenous youth in BC are food insecure. So it's hard to learn, it's hard to get ahead when you are in that kind of a position. But the good news is there's huge opportunity. We see it, we feel it at Tea Creek. We've had over 50 First Nations in BC alone reach out to Tea Creek, wanting to partner, wanting to do similar things to what we're doing. We've had an additional couple dozen from the rest of the country, including Alberta and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, reach out and even come to Tea Creek for tours from all the way on the other side of Turtle Island. So there's just a massive amount of drive amongst our people to be successful, to get back to the land, to increase water holding, the health of the forests, local food production, clean water, mental health, physical health, all of those things. But again, I've said this really clearly, and I'm going to have to keep saying it, we're not being met. We're not being met by government, by the Crown. And that's not what we're seeing. We're still seeing that a majority are small, but the opportunity is huge. So we can do this. The future looks bright if we have meaningful partners that maintain the integrity of Indigenous-led, Indigenous leadership. We can make a massive difference to our local economies and to the world. So thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.